Do you remember last week in going through the first 15 verses of Psalm 37, we started really looking at a few other psalms talking about how God reigns. We talked about the foundation of His throne is righteousness and justice. He is always going to work off of righteousness and justice. You also see a patient aspect with God, but He will not allow wickedness to continue on forever. And so oftentimes, in what we looked at the beginning of Psalm 37, it's easy to become angry whenever you see wrongdoers continue seemingly without obstruction at times, and to realize we have to rest in God's justice and righteousness and how He is going to do things. I want you to turn over to Psalm 73 and see a parallel thought that goes together with Psalm 37. If you feel like you have dyslexia, it's okay. Psalm 73. And I want you to notice these first three verses and see how they tie in together with what's in Psalm 37. But Psalm 73, look at verses 1, 2, and 3. Surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. But as for me, my feet came close to stumbling. My steps had almost slipped, for I was envious of the arrogant, as I saw the prosperity of the wicked. Now this is Asaph that writes Psalm 73, so this is not David. What is he referring to whenever he says, what caused him to almost slip? What was he focusing on? Yeah, the prosperity of the wicked. He says, "Boy, my feet came close to stumbling, my steps had almost slipped." He says, "For I was envious of the arrogant." Seems like people stomp around in arrogance and they seem to get their way because they're the loudest ones. And Asaph is looking at this and saying, man, I almost slipped. I almost failed. And he says, I even was to the point of being envious of the arrogant. Almost as if to say, I wish I could have that kind of boldness to tell people where they need to go and what they need to do. And you realize, you can already tell, Asaph's already learned a lesson here. Because he's telling you, I almost let myself go down with that. Now, look a little bit further in Psalm 73. Look down at verse 12. He says, Behold, these are the wicked, and always at ease. They have increased in wealth. Surely in vain I have kept my heart pure and washed my hands in innocence. For I have been stricken all day long and chastened every morning. Once again, what is Asaph looking at? He's looking at the wicked, and what is he noticing? Man, they seem to be at ease. They don't seem to have the troubles and difficulties that I do. They're more willing to just kind of go with the flow because there's no concern for what's righteous. And he says, look at these wicked people. He says, have I kept my heart pure in vain? If you remember back in verse 1, he said, surely God is good to Israel, to those who are pure in heart. He says, but man, these wicked folks kind of makes it look appetizing. Now, he says, is it vain that I've done this, that I've tried to make sure and be pure in heart and motive, to make sure that I'm innocent in what is evil? And he says, and yet here I am, I'm stricken all day long, striving to do what's right. And going, this is almost, you hear that statement of almost like, woe is me. I'm the only one who's trying to do what's good. And all these wicked folks are getting their way, and it all looks good to them. He says, earlier on, I almost slipped. I almost fell. Then, look down at verse 16. He says, when I pondered to understand this, it was troublesome in my sight. Did he have to take some time to understand the situation? Do we ever need that kind of time of reflection? We look around and we see wickedness flourish. We see those who are righteous be suppressed. And we kind of want to sit down and go, man, it sure does look a whole lot easier to be wicked. And it really looks a whole lot more prosperous to be wicked. Have I strived to be righteous and pure in heart to no avail? Is there no purpose in this? Do you ever have those kind of musings or thoughts? And Asaph's saying, I did too. And man, it almost cost me everything. Because then, he says, when I pondered this, it really bothered me. It was troublesome to me. And maybe you've had a few days in your life or more where you go, I've been kind of troubled by the same things. Now, notice what it brings him to. Look at verse 17. Until I came into the sanctuary of God, then I perceived their end. What changed his thought? Coming into the sanctuary of God. Think about sanctuary, a place of holiness. He says, I came before the holy God where he was to dwell. And then he says, then I perceived their end. How's it going to end for the wicked? Not well. He said, this helped me find a lot of clarity about what God is doing. Now, notice how he continues, verse 18. He says, surely you have set them in slippery places. You cast them down to destruction. You go, do you like trying to walk on ice? I mean, you think about slippery places. He says, I see where you've placed them. On the outside, it looks like, you know what, they're at rest, they're at ease. But what's underneath their feet? They're going to fall. And remember what Asaph said earlier on in the psalm? He says, my foot almost slipped. Because I was starting to go in the same direction and wonder and be troubled about, how come the wicked flourish? How come they're allowed to do that? Maybe it's in vain that I've kept my heart pure. So, whenever he ties these things together, he says, surely you set them in slippery places, you cast them down to destruction. It may look pretty now, but how's it going to be in the end? He says, destruction. It's not pretty anymore, is it? Then verse 19. He says, how they are destroyed in a moment. They are utterly swept away by sudden terrors. How quickly does it happen? just in a moment, all of a sudden. Asa's saying, then it made sense. I would rather go through the difficulties of suffering now for the short term and know that what lies ahead in the end is so far superior that whatever it is, I'll take it. Now, I want you to hold your place here. Look over at 2 Corinthians. Second Corinthians chapter 4, look down at verse 16. Listen to Paul reflect on all of his difficulties. I mean, we're not going to read through, there's a long list in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 of all the different perils that Paul had been in because of preaching and teaching the Word and the resurrection of Jesus. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 16 says, therefore we do not lose heart, but though our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. What did Paul keep central in his mind? The inner man. What was going on with the outer? Man, it's decaying. I mean, if you stop and really take that to heart, how many years do you get along before you start to look at yourself and realize, you know what, my body is not what it used to be. The strength that I used to have, I no longer have. The endurance that I used to have, I don't have anymore. And sometimes we look at that and people get so discouraged. But the question is, why are we looking at the outer to be the central focus? Because here's Paul, he says, look, he says, our outer man is decaying, yet our inner man is being renewed day by day. What should we be doing spiritually? There should be a renewal that's going day by day, and there should be a growth that comes through the Lord to go, you know what, I'm gaining strength in things. To be able to go, all right, here's the direction I need to go. Then, verse 17. For momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. How did Paul consider all of his sufferings? Momentary light affliction. Now, this is a man who was stoned with rocks to the point where they thought he was dead. He says, momentary light affliction. Beaten with rods without number. Momentary light affliction. You see all the difficulties he goes through. And to go, he says, you know what? That is not the focus. He says, those things are only momentary and light compared to the glory that's coming because of what Jesus has done. Now, he lays it out. He says, it's producing for us an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. How does the momentary light affliction produce that without us being renewed in the inner man? The answer is it won't, will it? If we're just focusing on the outer, what happens through the afflictions? What happens to faith? It starts to fade and tail as we just look at the physical side. He's saying, look, you're going to have to look at things and put them in the proper perspective. You might look around, you might see wicked people and go, man, it seems like they just control things. And then you realize their end comes in a sudden way, and you go, oh, I didn't expect that. And you go, now I see why I'm striving to keep my heart pure. Now I understand why I'm trying to make sure I walk in innocence. Then, even as he continues here into verse 18, he says, has an eternal weight of glory far beyond all comparison. Like you can't even compare the two. It's like trying to compare the speed of a fly compared to a rocket. It's like you can't even equate the two. Then, verse 18, he says, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal. He says, we don't focus on what's seen. You look around, you see wicked folks strive. You look at them, you go, they don't have a care in the world. And you go, oh, that sounds so good. And you go, nope, I'm looking at eternity. And saying, I don't want the same end as what they have. And I would really prefer it if they would come to faith and be partakers of the same. And so you see what Paul's laying out here. He says, you can't focus on what you see. And that's what got Asaph. He was focusing in on what he could see as opposed to looking at the eternal side. But as soon as he saw the eternal side, he says, I came to my senses. Now it makes sense. Now, turn back to Psalm 37. So when you think about God reigning in terms of righteousness and justice, Eric.
That only reminds me of the parable where Jesus talked about the tares and
the wheat and the tares?
yeah, how they all go up together, and at the end, the wheat are gathered up and put in one pile, and the tares are gathered up and put into the fire.
Put into the fire. And you're like the parable of the wheat and the tares, that there's a place where they grow together. And you go, we'll just wait till the end, and we'll divide them all out. Here in Psalm 37, look at verse 16. We'll pick up where we left off last week. Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. Better is the little of the righteous than the abundance of many wicked. Why? Why? The abundance of the wicked is temporary. What do you know about the little of the righteous? They're going to do just fine. They have what they need, right? Now, if you were to kind of maybe make a heading for these verses, like verses 16 down through verse 22, you're going to see a comparison between looking at the righteous versus the wicked. And he's going to draw a great contrast between the two. And in seeing that contrast, really throughout the rest of the chapter, you're going to see him talk about righteousness. It's going to show up 8 more times. You're going to see him talk about just or justice. It's going to pop up 2 more times. And you're going to see, man, I don't have to fret. I don't have to be angry whenever you see wrongdoers and go, oh, man, it looks like they're thriving. He says, because you're looking at the end. You're looking at the eternal side. He says, because whenever you just look on the surface at the physical and you go, man, look at the abundance of the wicked and look at the little of the righteous, you'll look at that and go, how can this be just? How can this be right? But if you look at the spiritual side, you go, this makes perfect sense. The righteous have what they need. And it doesn't matter how big the abundance of the wicked is, it's not going to save them. Now, look at verse 17. He says, for the arms of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord sustains the righteous. All right, I'm going to ask this. How many of you have ever broken an arm? Anybody? Raise your hand. All right, broke a finger. You've had those experiences. Number one, that doesn't mean that you're wicked. I know you're looking at this and going, why in the world would he ask people to raise their hand? Here's the point I want you to see. When your arm was broken, at the very beginning, did you realize how limited you were going to be? Because then as you strive to live with a broken arm, you go, oh, that's right, I can't do that anymore. Oh, I can't pull myself up that way. Oh, I can't do that. Realize, guess what happens with the wicked? Notice he doesn't say their arm will be broken. What does he say? Arms, plural. He says the arms of the wicked, he says, will be broken. You know, can you imagine if you broken one arm? Can you imagine if you broke both of them at the same time? How helpless would you be? If someone was pursuing you, how would it go? You're going down, right? And you won't have an arm to catch yourself on the way down either. And you won't have an arm to help you get back up either. So you see a stark difference between the righteous and the wicked. He says, for the arms of the wicked will be broken, but the Lord sustains the righteous. Notice, here's the Lord to sustain those who are going after what's righteous. Verse 18, the Lord knows the days of the blameless, and their inheritance will be forever. Once again, now we're back to David. And seeing these statements, look, he knows the blameless. He knows when you're innocent. He knows whenever you did no wrong. And he also knows how to sustain you. He says, and what you're building up is not just short term. What did David realize about the kingdom of Israel and Judah? It was not going to last forever. It was going to fall. Now, he knew that David was going to have a descendant that in the end was going to sit on the throne of God and reign forever. But as for those people who dwelt in Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria and Galilee, it's like it's not going to last here forever. Now, he says, but he knew what he was building was looking toward eternity. And if you notice, when he took his eyes off of eternity, what happened in his life? When he looked at Uriah's wife and took his eyes off of eternity, what happened in his life? It deteriorated, right? Now, notice how he continues. He says, their inheritance will be forever. Verse 19. And by the way, we're going to see it here in a minute in Psalm 37. Through the first part of the psalm, you really can't tell exactly how old David is when he's writing this. But here in a little bit, you're going to see his age. He's going to give it away pretty starkly. But notice, this is him really looking back over life and going, look, this is what's going on. I've seen this happen. Then, as he continues here, because verse 19, he says, they will not be ashamed in the time of evil, and in the days of famine they will have abundance. Now, think about what's going on here. In the days of famine, they will have an abundance. Who's sustaining the righteous? God is. Now, who can you think back on in the book of Genesis that it was a time of famine, but him and his family had abundance? Joseph, right? Because of God using Joseph to interpret the dreams of Pharaoh, everything's stored up, everything's ready, so that whenever the famine comes, Egypt literally buys up everybody, everything, all the land, all the crops, because of what God provided through Joseph. You go, you know what, it's funny. You look around, you go, everybody else is just struggling, and now whenever the time of famine comes, the wicked aren't looking so great anymore. Look, we're still sustained. We made it. How many stories you can go back and read in Scripture, even in the previous century, of people going through the Great Depression, and yet people of faith coming through, and you realize, and God took care of them as they looked to hold and do what was right. And you go, how does that happen? Just luck, I guess. No, it's not. Don't be foolish and think that way. Realize this is what God does with the righteous. Even in a time of famine, they find themselves in abundance. He says, they will not be ashamed in the time of evil. What do they have to be ashamed of? They're doing what's right before God. Now, he continues on, verse 20. Here's the opposite side. He says, but the wicked will perish. Well, that was pretty blatant. He says, but the wicked will perish, and the enemies of the Lord will be like the glory of the pastures. They vanish, like smoke that vanishes away. What is the glory of the pastures? Flowers. He says, you know what, you look out at you can think about it in many different ways. You've probably seen several different fields in your life that were just at the right time. All the flowers were blossoming up, and you thought, that is just a beautiful, beautiful scene. And yet, if you went through there just a few months later, what would it look like? Well, this looks dead. Is there a drought going on? But you realize, he says, you know what? You may look at wickedness and the arrogant and the evildoer and go, it looks like they have it so easy. Yet, what's it going to be like shortly? All that flowery glory is all going to be dead. Now, this is always kind of the problem for the fellas. You go, you know what? I want to buy my wife some flowers. And if you're foolish, you say, oh, let these represent my love to you. Well, that works good for a few days. What's it going to look like in a few weeks? Oh, I see your love's dead now. But you realize, that's the idea here with the wicked, of going, yeah, it looks nice now. Just give it some time and look at the end. It's not going to be nice at all. You won't want to be there. Then he continues on. He says, they vanish like smoke. Like smoke, they vanish away. Whenever you put out the fire, how long does it take for the smoke to go away? Not very long. You see, once again, verse 21, the wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. He says, for those blessed by him will inherit the land, but those cursed by him will be cut off. And if you notice in verse 21, the wicked are selfish and self-centered. So they borrow, but what do they not do? They don't pay back. Here's just a little financial note for you. If you make a promise to pay something, you're going to be wicked or righteous? I mean, does God care about if we pay our bills or not? Yes, he does. Should we bite off more than what we can do? We've got to be careful. Now, I understand there's some situations that can pop up that make us kind of fall a little short. But if we knowingly sign things that go, you know what, there's no way I'm going to be able to afford this, then what are we doing? Our desires are getting ahead of what's righteous and innocent. If you notice the other side here is, he says, but with the righteous, he says, is gracious and gives. They are selfless. They go, I'm going to give you more that will be help you, and I'm ready to just give it to you. He says, they don't take out a loan with it. We'll see that here a little bit. He says, give it over. And then 22, he says, here's the great difference between the righteous and the wicked. He says, those blessed by him, the righteous, will inherit the land. He says, but those cursed by him will be cut off. Now, if you take that to eternal, what's the difference? Righteous are going to dwell with the Lord. The wicked will be away from the Lord, and they'll be cut off from him completely. Now, you come to these next few verses, 23 through 26, and really kind of the overall heading is, who establishes the righteous? Who's the one who gives them the stability? Now, look at verse 23. It says, the steps of a man are established by the Lord, and he delights in his way. He says, the Lord is the one that establishes the steps. If you're going to walk in what's righteous, you can expect the Lord to establish the steps. He'll take care of it. And the real idea is, we delight in doing it God's way. I want you to think about the last time that you had that opportunity to decide to love someone, to literally sacrifice something for the betterment of somebody else who you didn't know if they would respond well to it or not. And whenever you did that, knowing that you were walking in the steps of Jesus, did it delight you? Did you find joy in it? Because you realize that's where the Lord establishes us. When we walk in the footprints of Jesus, to see it and do it his way, he says, and you find that you're just overly delighted to be able to sacrifice to do it his way. And you find the joy of it. He says, and the Lord establishes. Verse 24, when he falls, he will not be hurled headlong, because the Lord is the one who holds his hand. For those of you that have had small children, whenever, especially when they're first learning to walk, you hold them by the hand for a reason. You don't want them to fall. And yet, inevitably, they're going to trip, and then by your hand, you keep those knees from getting all skinned up. Because you're the one who sustains them. You hold them up. And you think in the same way it can happen even in old age. To go, even whenever the body is not what it used to be, to go to have someone there to hold your hand, hold your arm as you walk along, and you go, to find stability whenever frailty has set in. And you go, that's the picture of the Lord with us. He doesn't care that we're weak. We're all weak compared to him. He says, you need to know that I'm holding your hand as long as you delight to do things my way. And I will keep you from so many things. He says, you won't have to fall headlong. He says, because I'm holding you. Now, He continues on here, verse 25. He says, I have been young and now I am old, yet I have not seen the righteous forsaken or his descendants begging bread. Well, this gives it away. If you ever wondered where David is in his life in this psalm, he says, I'm an old man. He says, and I've looked at it all through my life. And he says, I have never seen the righteous begging for bread. Now, that doesn't mean the righteous. Notice earlier on he says, better is the little with the righteous than great abundance or great wealth with the wicked. David says, all my life there's one thing I've never seen. I've never seen righteous people begging for bread, which is kind of unique because it also tells you a little something. Whenever you see somebody begging for bread, what do you know? Are they working off of what's righteous? Once again, you have to be careful here. There was a lame beggar that sat outside the temple being carried along in Acts chapter 3, and he was a man of faith. So be careful with that. But see the overwhelming picture here. He says, I haven't seen the righteous forsaken. He says, or his descendants begging bread, verse 25. All day long he is gracious and lends, and his descendants are a blessing. He says, all day long he's gracious. And I want you to notice he uses this word lends. Typically if somebody, well, let's put it this way. Let's just imagine you're going to buy a house or a car. And you're going to go to the bank, take out a loan, and they said, you know what, we're going to give you this loan at 1%. You would go, oh, this is great. This is wonderful. The Lord has blessed me. Realize this. For the Israelites, and it's mentioned in Exodus, it's mentioned in Leviticus, and it's mentioned in Deuteronomy, you are not to lend to your own brothers and sisters at interest. In the book of Nehemiah, some of the captives who've come back to Jerusalem are lending money at 1%. And the prophet tells them, how come you don't fear God? Why have you forgotten? How often do you see people, even among God's own people, go, I'm going to give you a break. I'll just lend this to you for just 1%. At the same time, back there in the Old Testament, they could do it to a foreigner. God said, that's okay with them. But you realize, what really is righteousness? Because why do you want interest? Why do banks charge interest? Because they're making a profit off of somebody else's need. Is that the way we're supposed to be? Let me profit by the incapabilities of my own brothers and sisters in Christ. That's not righteous. That's not righteous at all. Now, you look at this and he says, this is the way the righteous are. They realize who's going to sustain them. God is. And so he puts it out here. He says, all day long he is gracious and lends, and his descendants are a blessing. Because they get to learn what righteousness looks like. And once you've seen it, it's a lot easier to imitate than to have never seen it before. Now, he moves on into this next section, verses 27 through 34. And you really come to find out what's the character of the righteous. What are they truly like? Verse 27. Depart from evil and do good, so you will abide forever. Well, this makes it seem pretty simple, doesn't it? You want to be righteous? Don't do evil. Maybe you're thinking back in Proverbs 8:13, it talks about the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Fearing God means I can't have anything to do with that. It doesn't mean, okay, well, these people are evil, so I can never talk to them. Well, how are they going to hear the gospel if you don't encounter them? But to understand, all right, is there an opportunity here? He says, depart from evil, this is choices, and do good. He says, you'll abide forever. Was that just forever in the promised land? What forever are we really talking about? Once again, you see the look upon eternity. Now, verse 28. For the Lord loves justice. Here's our words again, justice. And does not forsake his godly ones. They are preserved forever, but the descendants of the wicked will be cut off. He's talked about righteousness so often. Now he comes back to justice. Hey, his throne is founded on righteousness and justice. He says, look, you don't have to worry about the wicked. The Lord loves justice. And typically you do what you love, right? As long as it's not evil, do good. But what he lays out here, he says, the Lord loves justice. He says, and does not forsake his godly ones. Really, that's what holiness is. It's God-like behavior. That's what holy really is. Holy God. Now, he says, they're preserved forever, not just short term. We're talking about eternity. He says, but what about the descendants of the wicked? You want to be with them now? You envy them now? Are you looking at them going, boy, it looks so easy for them? No, now that you see eternity, you go, ooh, I don't want anything to do with that. Then, he continues on, 29. The righteous will inherit the land and dwell in it forever. Once again, talking about spiritually. He says, the mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice. Once again, how does he have wisdom? Proverbs 9:10 talks about the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Here's the reason he has wisdom to share, because the righteous works off the fear of the Lord. Now, he says, this is what his mouth speaks. It utters wisdom. His tongue speaks justice. Who did he learn justice from? God, because that's what his throne is founded on. Then, verse 31, the law of his God is in his heart. His steps do not slip. Notice, what keeps your feet stable? What's in the heart? The law of the Lord. Looking at his standard of righteousness, not whatever standard I've made up. He says, letting his standard reign. Looking at Jesus and his righteousness. Now, notice how it continues further. He says, verse 32, the wicked spies upon the righteous and seeks to kill him. Who are you thinking of? Jesus. You can even think of David. Saul wanted to kill David. You can think of several other people. You notice, if you're going to strive to do what's right, it means you will have enemies. And he says, and the wicked will spy it out. He says, they're looking for it. He says, they're seeking to kill, verse 33. The Lord will not leave him in his hand, or let him be condemned when he is judged. He says, the Lord's not going to leave you then. God is not one who says, I just take care of you when it's easy. He says, no, I hold your hand even through to the end, to take you beyond just this world. Then, verse 34, wait for the Lord and keep his way, and he will exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you will see it. So often, the one thing that we miss is patience. Wait for the Lord. Be sure that you're walking in what is righteous and good. He says, and let the Lord deliver you. And watch his hand at work. And then notice what he says at the end of that verse. And you will see it. So often we lack the patience to wait on God. And then we wonder why we don't ever see his hand at work. There are some things you just have to wait on. And to go, I can't remove the wicked out of this situation. I'll just have to do what is right, do what is good, and put myself in the hands of the Lord. And he says, and you will see it. Now, notice, we get into this last section, and probably the overall theme of 35 through 40 is, what's the conclusion for the wicked and the righteous? How's it going to turn out? Well, verse 35, he says, I have seen a wicked, violent man spreading himself like a luxuriant tree in its native soil. He says, let's see, violent people ever work off of anger? You remember earlier on where it says, do not fret, talking about anger. He says, do not fret, it leads only to evil doing. Well, what happens? Anger boils, and it boils up to what point? Violence, and then it keeps on going, right? And David said, I've seen a wicked, violent man. And boy, he just spread out himself like a luxuriant tree. I wonder if he was talking about Nabal here. I've seen a foolish man. I've seen an angry man. And boy, he looked like he had wealth. Didn't take God long to cut down Nabal, did it? Just 10 days later, struck him dead. Now, I want you to notice he makes this comparison. Verse 36. Then he passed away, and lo, he was no more. I sought for him, but he could not be found. Now, if you've ever had a tree in your yard, no matter how luxurious it was or not, and you cut it down, and all of a sudden they grind out the stump, and then all of a sudden you plant the seed, and the grass grows right over the top of where the trunk was, and all of a sudden, after a while, you start to even forget there was ever a tree there. That's how it's going to be with the wicked. You go, oh yeah, I forgot all about him. I hadn't thought about them in a long time. Can you believe what God did? How he delivered? How he took care of things? And you realize, he says, that's the way it is. Then verse 37, mark the blameless man, and behold the upright, for the man of peace will have a posterity. He says, you know what? The men of peace, they're going to pass away too. There's going to be a physical death. Then he says, but mark them. He says, when you find somebody who's righteous, take a good look at them. He says, look at what the Lord does. Don't look at them. Look at the Lord that sustains them. Verse 38, but transgressors will be altogether destroyed. The posterity of the wicked will be cut off. Are the wicked going to die as well? Yeah. But what's the difference? They're completely cut off. They're not going to get to go enjoy life with the Lord forever. Verse 39, he comes back to the righteous. But the salvation of the righteous is from the Lord. He is their strength in time of trouble, and they know it. That's the thing. It's not just that the Lord is their strength in times of trouble. They know that the Lord is the strength in the time of trouble. And they know to turn to him in times of trouble even more intently than they were already. It's not like the righteous, just when times get difficult, turn toward God. They're turning toward the Lord the whole time, and especially whenever things get difficult, they make sure to center in on him even more to make sure that there's no envy of the wrongdoers. I don't want their end. And then if you notice what else is put here, verse 40, the Lord helps them and delivers them. He delivers them from the wicked and saves them because they take refuge in him. That's why he spares them. That's why he delivers them, because they've made their refuge in him. Now, I want you to take this thought, and we've said it all the way through the summer in talking about Jesus is the refuge. He is the place where you find deliverance. He's where you find strength and wisdom. I want you to turn over to the New Testament. Look at 2 Corinthians again, but look at chapter 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. Look at verse 20. Here are the writers of Corinthians, Paul and others. He says, therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. As though God were making an appeal through us, we beg you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Ambassadors don't work on their own authority. Ambassadors work because of the authority they've been given. He says, we're here as ambassadors for Christ. We're here to tell you about God's terms for peace. He says, and we beg you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. And reconcile is just a big fancy English word for to do again, counsel, to make friends. Reconcile means to make friends again. He says, but this is God's terms of peace. Verse 21. He made him, speaking of Jesus, who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He's the refuge. He says that we might become the righteousness of God in Jesus. How righteous is God? He is the example of what righteousness looks like. And he says, and this is what the death of Jesus does for us. Whenever we're baptized into Christ, united with his death, burial, and resurrection, you go, that's when we become friends with God. Because the one who knew no sin, Jesus, took sin for our behalf so that we can be in him and be made righteous. Which is the whole purpose of what we studied in Psalm 37. Look at the difference between the righteous and the wicked. And now we pursue God with everything we have and never letting up. And to go, and now we find security, stability, God to hold our hand through the difficulties and the joyous times as well. Who could ask for anything more? And yet, you see him lift us up and to say, will you wait for me? Whenever you see the wicked prosper, think about eternity. Is that what you really want? And to go, do what's good, respond out of what's right, and let me be the one to fight for you. Because you'll see it right before your very eyes. Now, this is going to end our summer of the Psalms, looking at the curriculum. We'll be back next summer. And we'll be starting in Psalm 38, I think going through 50. So look out, here it comes. And next week, start the book of Nahum with Brent right here. So, all right, have a good week.